example, whether or not the train's going to crash. A more complex risk would be high-speed trains that are networked across systems, where you generally know what kind of risk and the elements that you need to assess it, but it's a very complex system. So that analogy there was the high-speed train wreck. One might think about a well-studied particle in the environment as something that's complex, but generally we know how it's going to travel, we know how it's going to behave. The model may be complex, but the elements to assess risk are there. Well, now I think with emerging technologies, we're moving into more areas of uncertainty and ambiguity. And it actually requires, and this report makes that point, it requires more engagement with affected stakeholders and civil society. And so I wonder, when we talk about nanotechnology, whether we are talking about just uncertainty, but not just uncertainty, but also ambiguity. And that's the term they use, where you don't even know what you need to know. It's kind of like genetically engineered organisms, where you can't even really define what the potential risks are that you may encounter in the future. And I believe, again, that as we move across this continuum, that it changes, our goal changes from advice and answers more to context framing and engagement, and helping them, the enabling model of risk communication. So with high ambiguity, more need for deliberation in a context and framing approach to risk communication. But the other challenge I think we have with nanomaterials is that the products are so diverse. We've got passive nanostructures that are in tennis rackets that are just going to basically sit there and diffuse out a little bit. We have active nanostructures where we're actually putting things into the human body or the environment that can adjust and move and evolve, in a sense, as they travel through that environment. They might be based on biological molecules like proteins or DNA. And so I really think that when we're thinking about communication tools and instruments and strategies for engaging the public, we have to at least acknowledge the product dependency of risk. And some products might be more simple types of questions about risk, and others may be very ambiguous in the sense that we don't know what these active nanostructures may do in the environment or in the human body. So I think there's a lot of diversity to nanotechnology, and I like this kind of model. Now, I've argued with the IRGC that we need engagement throughout all different kinds of risks, even the simple ones, because the simple risks are even really not that simple when you look at dose response curves and interpreting the uncertainty at low doses versus high doses. But for what it's worth, I do like how they think about the different types of levels of information that we have about the risk, and the absolute need for engagement when we get into the more ambiguous area. So this is just another slide to show you that risk assessment for nanomaterials is very complex. And the studies that come out are going to be not necessarily, there's only been really one or two articles, or just a few, I should say, that come out that really do risk assessment and try to combine, the hazard ID, the exposure assessment in the risk characterization phases. But they're going to come in bits and pieces. So you're going to have one study come out, on whether it can be whether the nanoparticle is taken up by organisms in the environment, like fish or Daphnia or what have you. So that one study, what the heck does it mean in the context of risk? I'm confused about it as a risk assessor. Somehow we need to, I think, enable the public, the various public stakeholders, to interpret that and what it means in a risk context. So again, this model of risk assessment for nanoparticles includes a deliberative analytical process with problem formulation and input from interested and affected parties throughout the entire process. So we'll hear more about public engagement later on today. But I just wanted to make the point that information comes in bits and pieces, but risk assessment is extremely complex with various stages, various bits of information that you need along this continuum. One of the biggest challenges right now is getting the sources of nanomaterials. We don't have a national or even local databases on where nanomaterials are produced, when they're produced, and whether or not they're being released into the environment. And that is really kind of the first step of exposure assessment, is the source of these nanomaterials. So we've basically got very little information, from my perspective, on risk for nanomaterials right now. And so how do we frame individual studies to the public, I think is the question. So I do like the mental models approach that was mentioned yesterday by Professor Klauberg. And I just want to go over it a little bit for those of you who aren't as familiar with it. But basically the approach is a visual approach. I'm a visual learner. And I think many people are visual learners, but they're not getting information really framed visually, I don't think, very well yet in this area of nanomaterials. So I think the mental model approach not only allows us to compare the expert model of risk with the non-expert model of risk, but it allows us to give we visual learners more capacity to understand risk and what we're looking at. So diagram allows representation of knowledge of experts from diverse disciplines, and there was a paper that just came out in the journal Risk Analysis by Caseman and Morgan. And I like this quote: "The influence diagram allows a quick visual check of the factors that must be covered when evaluating audience information needs." So I guess my question I'm posing to this group of communication scientists is, how can we use the influence diagram tool to communicate about risk? And maybe that might be one of the things we test in our NERT grant. We could incorporate it in some way, potentially.